The Rolex GMT Master II 16710 Pepsi. I've wanted this watch for a long time. I brought it in for review just to get a feel for it. It may not be the GRAIL watch that I was kind of anticipating. In the 1950s, Pan Am asked Rolex to basically create a watch, or at least that's the story, to create a watch for their pilots to be able to check GMT time, or Greenwich Mean Time, in relation to local time. So they used the bezel, a rotating bezel that gave you a 24-hour marker with two colors, night and day, to be able to adjust to tell them what Greenwich Mean Time was in relation to local time. It added a fourth hour hand to actually give them that time. And if you're in the watch community, or you've been buying watches, or you've been interested in watches, you've heard of the GMT Master II, you've heard of the Pepsi, and everyone tends to like it. Everyone raves about it, everyone's interested in it. The newer versions of it are going for still double their original retail price. They've got white gold versions, they've got all sorts of different versions of the same style watch. This style watch has spawned an entire era of GMT watches, which is the hot thing. Everyone has a GMT watch, everyone's got an affordable one. There's a lot of different variations, different styles, but this was the original four-hander GMT style watch. And I've wanted one for years. But what's interesting about the GRAILs, or the watches that you've wanted for a long time, is that when you finally get them, your feeling about the watch can sometimes be different than what it originally was. And in my case, it's a little different. Now, general specs, let's get that out of the way first. The watch itself is a 40mm watch. It wears like a lot of the older style Rolex watches, which is that it's got a very flat profile. It's got a pretty nice base, so the watch feels very solid on the wrist. It doesn't feel too small or too big. It isn't flared out like the modern Rolexes with those big hefty lugs like the modern Batman. It has a much more sleek design to it. This has the chamfers on the lugs that they have gotten rid of. It has an aluminum bezel insert, which is obviously of the old Rolex versions. This one's from 2002 and has a 3185 caliber movement in it. So this one has the one where the GMT hand wobbles when you move the hour hand independently. This style watch is the exact same as all of the original GMT Master IIs, which the difference between the Master and the Master II is the Master II, you can independently set the hour hand. The original Masters, you only could move the bezel. It has the same crown guards, the smaller crown to operate it. It's on an oyster bracelet with a folding clasp. Obviously no like on-the-fly adjustment or anything like that. It's what you expect of an 80s, 90s, or early 2000s Rolex 40mm watch. And I love it. I love the size of it. Now, obviously, I love my Polar. I love the size. I love how it wears. It's the perfect amount of feels like it's solid on the wrist without being overwhelming. So you could go down to the 36mm Rolexes, or even just 36mm watches in general, or 38s, and then you start to not notice that they're on the wrist. When you get into this style model or this feel, it fits, like it feels solid, but you know it's there, but it's not so big to the point where you really you're thinking about it all the time. These models have gone down in price, and they've kind of fluctuated a lot. I think when I first got into watches, they were around 8,000, and then they got up to maybe 16, depending on the model and condition, maybe a little bit more. Right now, they tend to be around 11 to 12,000, depending on condition, of course. This is a really nice example. It's got some divots in the actual lugs themselves, but the chamfers look pretty nice. The bezel has been replaced, so that's why it looks so spectacular. So my thoughts on the model line. The things that I love about it are the size, the proportions, the feel, the wear, the look. The one thing that stands out the most about this watch is the bezel. When you're looking in the mirror, boom, the bezel's the first thing you see. You see the red, you see the blue. When you're wearing a jacket over this and it covers part of it, the first thing you see is that separation between the blue and the red on the bezel. It's loud. That part is loud. But the dial itself, being a black dial, it disappears. I didn't notice it as I walked around for the last couple weeks. It was really interesting to me to see that, like on my Explorer 2 on the Polar, I noticed the dial. It's loud, it's there, it's vibrant because it's white. But with this, the dial was very quiet. It didn't really call any attention to itself at all, so the bezel did all the talking. The only thing I really noticed about this watch was that bezel. In the sunlight, what's interesting is the bezel itself. When I say bezel, I mean like the grip on the outside. Those divots are polished, and so in the sunlight, they actually reflect light pretty well. And so it adds a little bit more glitz or pizzazz to the watch that I really didn't expect to be there when I was first wearing it. I thought I'd noticed the bezel in the watch, but the bezel I noticed the bezel colors, you know, like the aluminum insert portion, but not necessarily the exterior. But I noticed that a lot. It really screamed out in really highlight scenarios. And so I thought that was really interesting and it added to it. So generally, the biggest positive about this watch, aside from the wearability, everyone likes 40mm Rolex watches, is the fact that the bezel design is fantastic. The way that that plays with the light, the way that the bezel insert has those two splashes of color with a backdrop of a very muted dial. I think it's really the perfect amount of, you know, fun and excitement and something different, and calls some attention to itself without being really loud or brash or anything like that. A couple other things I noted that were interesting about this bezel is in low light scenarios, it looked like a Coke bezel. The blue was dark enough to the point where, you know, if I tilt my wrist and I look at it right now, and now I'm in studio light, so it's hard, it would look like black on top with still red on the bottom. It made me think, you know, the Coke and the Pepsi are so similar at that point. Why wouldn't you get the Pepsi and then in low light, it feels like a Coke bezel. So I thought that was kind of cool. It kind of took away the interest in wanting a Coke bezel because I can have that look in low light scenarios, and then in, you know, brighter scenarios, then I have the Pepsi look. In really bright scenarios, the way that the indices actually reflect, I think, shows more of their shape. So these indices have a larger fill around the exterior before the actual lume plot on the center. And so sometimes in different lighting scenarios, all you can see is the lume plot itself, which look a little small for the dial. But then other times when it's in really highlight scenarios, you can see, because those indices are reflecting, the rim around the indices are reflecting. And so you can see the actual size of each of them. And so they look more proportionate to the dial, which wasn't an issue on the Polar because they're black rimmed, so that I always see them. So on this, the indices looked smaller, which I thought was interesting. But dislikes about the watch, the 3185, I think it feels a little less refined when I operate it. Not drastically so, but just a little bit, only because that GMT hand wobbles when I operate it. The bracelet is what you expect. You know, granted, I'd love to have a upgraded bracelet, but the bracelet's what you expect, so I don't really have any detractors there. And the watch itself is kind of what you expect. I mean, if you're looking for this sort of watch, it hits everything. I mean, if you have an expectation about a watch and then you buy it and you had expectations about this, it's gonna nail every single one of those. But what's interesting is if you already have a watch that's very similar, I think it robs some of that excitement. For example, I have the Polar. And so the fact that I have this Explorer 2 and I've been, you know, using it and wearing it for the last year almost, means that when I wear this, it feels like almost the same thing with a different dial and a different bezel, because that's exactly what it is. It's almost the exact same, but with a couple small changes. And so I thought that was interesting. I think it took some of the, you know, how excited I would have been if I bought it on its own, which isn't really a downside, I guess, but I wanted to kind of talk through that was an interesting point. I am going to make a separate video where I actually compare the two and my overall thoughts if I was going to buy them to begin with from the get-go, which is kind of what I had imagined at one point, was either the Explorer 2 or the Pepsi. So I'll do a comparison video at another time. But the watch is fantastic. I mean, if you're looking for this, if you're looking for a Pepsi and you want one that doesn't have the modern size, the modern bezel, which those numbers get really beefy, the modern heft of both the watch and the actual bracelet itself, then this hits all of that. If you know what you're in for and this is what you're after, then you're really not going to be disappointed, I don't think, unless you're looking for a more, you know, loud watch. This is really quiet. I can't keep everything. I wish I could, but I can't, and I have too many attachments to the Polar, so I'm gonna end up keeping that. This is gonna be leaving tomorrow. Do me a favor and subscribe. This is another example of a watch I had to buy in order to review. What do you guys think? Do you own a Pepsi? Any questions? Leave them down below. The more of you guys that subscribe, the better for the channel and the better for my pocketbook. I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.